The leather-bound ledger still exists today in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, its pages yellowed and brittle, bearing meticulous entries in faded ink that document transactions no honest merchant would ever record. What makes this account book so disturbing isn't just the systematic nature of the financial records it contains, but the 7 mysterious deaths that occurred in Widow's Hollow between March and November of 1873, all connected to the woman who kept those careful, damning calculations. Local newspapers from that era, carefully preserved in private collections throughout eastern Kentucky, hint at a conspiracy so elaborate and ruthless that authorities buried the investigation to protect the reputations of prominent families whose fortunes had been built on the suffering of their neighbors. The truth behind this ledger reveals a web of war profiteering, betrayal, and mountain justice that shocked even the violence-hardened survivors of the Civil War. Before we continue with the story of Constance Harwick and the bloody reckoning that transformed Widow's Hollow into a place even desperate men refused to visit, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Stories like this one, buried by powerful families and hidden from history books, are exactly what we uncover here. The year 1873 found the Appalachian Mountains still bleeding from wounds inflicted during the Civil War and its chaotic aftermath. The mountain communities of eastern Kentucky existed in a lawless twilight where federal authority barely penetrated and local justice operated according to codes older than the Constitution. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad had reached Huntington that year, bringing the first real hope of prosperity to a region devastated by bushwhackers, deserters, and the systematic destruction of farms and livestock. Widow's Hollow sat in a natural depression between 2 ridges, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense forest for nearly 5 miles before reaching the main road to Lexington. The isolation that had once protected the settlement now trapped its residents in grinding poverty, cut off from the economic recovery beginning to touch other parts of Kentucky. Most of the young men had died in the war or disappeared into the Western Territories, leaving behind a community of widows, children, and broken veterans struggling to survive on exhausted land. The trading post that gave the hollow its livelihood had been established in 1868 by Constance Harwick, a woman whose husband had died at Antietam, leaving her with 2 young daughters and debts that threatened to destroy what remained of their mountain farm. At 42, Constance possessed the kind of sharp intelligence and iron will that mountain communities respected in their women, qualities that had allowed her to transform a failing homestead into the region's most successful commercial enterprise. Constance had built her business on a simple but profitable foundation. She would extend credit to desperate families during the harsh mountain winters, accepting property deeds and livestock as collateral for supplies that often meant the difference between survival and starvation. By 1872, she effectively controlled most of the arable land in the hollow, along with a network of financial obligations that bound her neighbors to her will as surely as legal contracts. What made Constance truly dangerous was her understanding of how the war's aftermath had created opportunities for those ruthless enough to exploit them. Veterans returning from battle often carried valuable items looted from battlefields or abandoned camps, goods they were desperate to trade for food and shelter. Constance would purchase these items for a fraction of their value, then sell them through contacts in Louisville and Cincinnati for enormous profits. Her trading post occupied a strategic location at the hollow's center, a 2-story log building with reinforced walls and gun ports that had been designed more like a fortress than a store. The ground floor served as the commercial space, its shelves stocked with everything from salt and sugar to ammunition and medical supplies. The second floor contained Constance's private office, where she kept her ledgers and conducted the more delicate aspects of her business. The ledger discovered after the fire contained entries that revealed the true scope of Constance's operations. Beyond simple merchant transactions, she had been running what amounted to a private banking system, loaning money at interest rates that would have made Civil War profiteers blush. More disturbing were the coded references to special arrangements and private consultations that suggested services far more sinister than legitimate trade. Dr. Samuel Wickham, the only physician within 30 miles of the hollow, had become one of Constance's most valuable assets through a series of financial entanglements that began with medical bills he couldn't pay after treating wounded veterans without compensation. By 1873, he owed Constance nearly $800, a debt that ensured his cooperation in ventures that required medical expertise and professional silence. The ledger contained detailed records of Dr. Wickham's consultations, coded entries that documented his involvement in activities ranging from the procurement of controlled substances to the falsification of death certificates. Most chilling were the references to examinations that preceded several of the mysterious deaths, suggesting that Wickham had been assessing victims' health and vulnerability before they were targeted for elimination. Judge Cornelius Blackwood, whose circuit court had jurisdiction over the hollow, appeared in the ledger as both debtor and business partner, his gambling losses to Constance carefully documented alongside payments for legal services that included the dismissal of charges against her associates and the expedited processing of property transfers. The judge's weakness for whiskey and cards had made him completely dependent on Constance's financial support, transforming him from a representative of law and order into an instrument of her will. Sheriff Thomas Garrett, elected to maintain peace in a county where violence was as common as morning fog, had been purchasing information from Constance about the movements and vulnerabilities of wanted men. His payments to her network of informants were recorded in the ledger alongside bounties collected for capturing or killing fugitives, creating a system where law enforcement had become indistinguishable from organized vigilantism. The crisis that would ultimately destroy Constance's empire began with the arrival of Marcus Fleming, a federal tax assessor dispatched from Frankfort to investigate reports of unreported income and property transfers in eastern Kentucky. Fleming was a meticulous bureaucrat in his early 30s, unmarried and incorruptible, who had earned a reputation for uncovering financial irregularities that local officials preferred to ignore. Fleming's preliminary investigation in nearby counties had already exposed several cases of tax evasion and fraudulent property sales, resulting in significant fines and the imprisonment of 2 prominent businessmen. His methodical approach to financial crime, combined with his authority to examine private records and interview witnesses under oath, made him exactly the kind of threat that Constance's operation could not survive. When Fleming arrived in Widow's Hollow on March 15, 1873, he immediately began requesting access to business records and tax documentation that Constance had never expected to be scrutinized by federal authorities. His polite but persistent inquiries about income sources, property acquisitions, and business partnerships revealed a level of knowledge about her affairs that suggested someone had been providing him with inside information. The ledger's entries for that period show a dramatic spike in coded communications and emergency consultations with her network of corrupted officials. Dr. Wickham was paid for medical evaluations of Fleming's health and habits, while Judge Blackwood received funds for legal research into the assessor's authority and potential vulnerabilities. Most ominously, Sheriff Garrett was compensated for security services that included surveillance of Fleming's activities and contacts. Fleming's death on March 28, 1873, was officially attributed to a riding accident on the treacherous mountain trails, but the ledger entries surrounding that date tell a different story. Dr. Wickham received a substantial payment for a consultation that occurred just hours before Fleming's horse was found with a broken leg beside his rider's corpse. The precise timing, combined with Wickham's subsequent certification of accidental death, suggests a level of coordination that contradicts the official version of events. What made Fleming's elimination particularly significant was how it established the template for the 6 murders that would follow. Each death appeared to result from the dangers inherent in mountain life: riding accidents, hunting mishaps, exposure, and illness. But the ledger's coded entries reveal a pattern of preparation, execution, and cover-up that transformed random misfortune into systematic assassination. The second victim, Revenue Agent Daniel Walsh, died on May 12th after developing symptoms that Dr. Wickham diagnosed as typhoid fever. The ledger shows payments to medical suppliers for substances that were never recorded in official pharmaceutical records, suggesting that Walsh's illness was chemically induced. His death eliminated another federal investigator who had been asking uncomfortable questions about tax compliance and property ownership. Jeremiah Stone, a local farmer who had been refusing to sell his land to Constance despite mounting debts, suffered a fatal hunting accident on June 3rd. The ledger indicates payments to hunting guides who had been hired to ensure Stone's solitary excursions into the forest would end with tragic consequences. His death allowed Constance to acquire valuable farmland while removing a potential witness to her illegal financial practices. Just when we thought we'd uncovered the extent of Constance's ruthless business methods, the true horror of her systematic elimination of threats becomes clear. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our research into America's buried secrets, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. By summer 1873, word had begun to spread beyond the hollow that men who crossed Constance Harwick had a tendency to die in convenient accidents. This reputation, rather than deterring potential threats, actually attracted the attention of people who believed they could profit from exposing her crimes or who saw her success as evidence of weakness that could be exploited. Captain William Morse, a Union veteran who had returned from the war with substantial savings and ambitious plans to establish a competing trading post, made the fatal mistake of publicly challenging Constance's monopoly on commercial activity in the region. His military experience and financial resources made him a legitimate threat to her control, particularly since he had begun recruiting other veterans to support his business venture. The ledger shows extensive planning for Morse's elimination, including payments to consultants who provided detailed information about his daily routines, business associates, and personal vulnerabilities. Dr. Wickham received compensation for evaluating Morse's medical history and identifying health conditions that could be exploited, while Judge Blackwood was paid for research into legal methods of challenging the veteran's property rights. Morse's death on July 19th was attributed to complications from old war wounds, but the ledger's entries suggest a more sinister explanation. Dr. Wickham's treatment of the veteran involved medications that may have exacerbated existing conditions rather than treating them, creating a natural-looking death that eliminated a dangerous competitor while maintaining plausible deniability. The pattern established by these carefully orchestrated deaths created a climate of fear that extended far beyond Widow's Hollow. Word spread through the mountain communities that Constance Harwick had achieved something approaching supernatural power over life and death, able to eliminate enemies through methods that left no evidence of murder. This reputation served her interests perfectly, deterring potential rivals while enhancing her influence over those who remained. However, the systematic nature of these eliminations also began to attract unwanted attention from sources that Constance's corrupted network could not control. State authorities in Frankfurt had noticed the unusual number of accidental deaths involving federal officials and potential witnesses in eastern Kentucky. More dangerously, private investigators hired by the families of some victims had begun conducting independent inquiries that threatened to expose the conspiracy. The fifth victim, Methodist minister Reverend Abel Crawford, died on August 14th after attempting to organize a church investigation into what he called ungodly influences operating in the region. Crawford had been documenting the moral decay he observed in the Hollow, including the corruption of local officials and the mysterious deaths of men who opposed certain business interests. The Reverend's death from apparent heart failure was certified by Dr. Wickham, but the ledger indicates substantial payments for spiritual consultations that preceded Crawford's demise. The euphemistic language suggests that Wickham may have used his medical knowledge to induce cardiac arrest through means that would be virtually impossible to detect with 1873 forensic techniques. The arrival of Private Detective Isaiah Turner on September 3, 1873, marked the beginning of the end for Constance's deadly enterprise. Turner had been hired by the widow of Marcus Fleming to investigate her husband's death, armed with resources and investigative techniques that made him far more dangerous than the local or federal officials who had previously threatened Constance's operation. Turner was a former Union intelligence officer who had spent the war conducting covert operations behind Confederate lines. His experience in gathering information, infiltrating hostile organizations, and surviving in dangerous territory made him uniquely qualified to uncover the truth about the suspicious deaths plaguing the region. More importantly, he had no local connections that could be compromised or exploited. The detective's approach differed fundamentally from that of previous investigators. Rather than announcing his presence and requesting cooperation from local officials, Turner arrived in the area posing as a traveling salesman and began conducting discreet inquiries among people who had no obvious connection to Constance's network. His investigation methodology, learned during wartime espionage operations, allowed him to gather information without alerting his targets to the true purpose of his presence. The ledger entries for September show increasing anxiety about Turner's activities, with multiple payments to informants attempting to determine his real identity and mission. Dr. Wickham was compensated for medical research into methods of eliminating threats without arousing suspicion, while Judge Blackwood received funds for legal consultations about potential responses to outside investigation. Turner's investigation quickly uncovered evidence of the conspiracy's scope and methods, but his attempts to gather proof that would stand up in court put him in mortal danger. The ledger shows that Constance had decided on October 1st to eliminate the detective using the same techniques that had successfully disposed of previous threats, but Turner's military training and paranoid caution made him a more challenging target. The detective had been carefully documenting his findings and regularly mailing reports to contacts outside the region, ensuring that his death would not silence his investigation. He had also taken precautions against the medical and legal manipulation that had enabled previous murders, avoiding contact with Dr. Wickham and maintaining his own security protocols that minimized opportunities for sabotage. Constance's decision to accelerate Turner's elimination led to the conspiracy's first significant mistake. Rather than waiting for an opportunity to stage a convincing accident, she authorized a direct attack that would be difficult to explain as natural causes. The ledger shows payments to security consultants for what was clearly intended to be an assassination disguised as a robbery or random violence. The attack on Turner occurred on October 15th during his return from a meeting with contacts in Lexington, but the detective's military reflexes and combat experience allowed him to survive the ambush. More importantly, the assault provided him with physical evidence of the conspiracy's existence, including weapons and personal items that could be traced back to known associates of Constance's organization. Turner's survival and escape transformed him from a covert investigator into an active threat with proof of attempted murder and sufficient evidence to expose the entire conspiracy. The ledger's final entries, dated October 2025, show frantic payments for emergency services and crisis management that indicate Constance's organization was preparing for total war rather than accepting exposure and prosecution. The conspiracy's desperation led to its 6th and 7th murders, the deaths of 2 potential witnesses who might have provided testimony supporting Turner's accusations. Both men died within hours of each other on October 22nd, officially from food poisoning, after attending a community gathering where contaminated preserves had been served. The timing and method suggested a level of preparation that contradicted the appearance of accidental death. Dr. Wickham's involvement in certifying these deaths while simultaneously treating the food poisoning of other attendees who survived provided Turner with additional evidence of medical murder disguised as public health crisis. The detective's documentation of the symptoms, combined with his analysis of the preserved food and witness testimony about its preparation and distribution, created a compelling case for deliberate poisoning. Judge Blackwood's attempts to prevent Turner from presenting evidence to state authorities backfired when his obvious bias and procedural irregularities attracted attention from higher judicial officials. The judge's efforts to suppress testimony and dismiss charges without proper hearings revealed the extent of his corruption and implicated him directly in the conspiracy's cover-up activities. The climactic confrontation occurred on November 8, 1873, when Turner returned to Widow's Hollow with federal marshals and state prosecutors to arrest Constance and her principal accomplices. The ledger suggests that Constance had prepared for this possibility by arranging to destroy all physical evidence of her crimes, including the systematic burning of her trading post and the elimination of witnesses who might testify against her. The fire that consumed Constance's building was no accident, despite initial reports that attributed it to an overturned lamp or faulty chimney. The ledger shows payments for fire safety consultations and emergency evacuation services that indicate the destruction was planned as part of a comprehensive evidence destruction protocol. The timing of the fire, just hours before the arrival of federal authorities, confirms its deliberate nature. What Constance hadn't anticipated was Turner's thorough documentation of her activities and his systematic copying of financial records during previous covert visits to her establishment. The detective had photographed pages from her ledgers and created duplicate records that survived the fire, preserving the evidence necessary to prosecute the conspiracy even after the original documents were destroyed. The arrest of Dr. Wickham, Judge Blackwood, and Sheriff Garrett occurred without resistance, but Constance herself was never found. The ledger's final entry, dated November 7th, shows a substantial payment to travel consultants and references to permanent relocation services that suggest she had prepared an escape route that would allow her to disappear with sufficient resources to establish a new identity elsewhere. The trials that followed exposed the full scope of the conspiracy and resulted in significant prison sentences for the surviving participants, but the true extent of Constance's crimes may never be fully known. State investigators estimated that she had been responsible for at least 7 murders and had systematically corrupted local government and law enforcement throughout eastern Kentucky. The financial damage to her victims' families totaled nearly $15,000, a substantial fortune in 1873 terms. Dr. Wickham received a sentence of 20 years in prison for his role in multiple murders disguised as medical treatment, though he died of tuberculosis after serving only 4 years. His confession, obtained in exchange for a reduced sentence, provided crucial details about the methods used to kill victims while maintaining the appearance of natural death. The medical knowledge he had perverted in service of murder was used by prosecutors to understand and prove the systematic nature of the crimes. Judge Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years and stripped of his judicial position, though political connections allowed him to serve only 8 years before receiving a pardon from the governor. His corruption had extended far beyond his relationship with Constance, encompassing years of bribery, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice that had compromised the entire regional legal system. Sheriff Garrett received 10 years for his role in the conspiracy, specifically his failure to investigate suspicious deaths and his active participation in covering up evidence of murder. His cooperation with prosecutors revealed the extent to which local law enforcement had been compromised, leading to a complete reorganization of police authority in the affected counties. The search for Constance Harwick continued for several years after the fire, with reported sightings in locations ranging from California to Mexico, but no definitive evidence of her fate was ever discovered. The ledger's references to permanent solutions and final arrangements in its closing entries have led some historians to speculate that she may have arranged her own death rather than face capture and trial. Local legend in Widow's Hollow holds that Constance never left the mountains, but instead retreated deeper into the wilderness, where she continued her predatory activities until old age or violence finally claimed her. Occasional disappearances of travelers and isolated homesteaders in the region were attributed to her continuing presence, creating a folklore that persisted well into the 20th century. The trading post site remained abandoned for nearly a decade after the fire, with local residents claiming that the location was cursed or haunted by the spirits of Constance's victims. When development finally occurred, workers reported finding additional hidden compartments containing documents and personal effects that suggested the building had served purposes far more sinister than legitimate commerce. The ledger itself was discovered in 1881 during the demolition of a related building, hidden in a concealed compartment that had somehow survived the fire. Its preservation allowed historians to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy and understand how systematic corruption could transform isolated mountain communities into killing grounds where justice was bought and sold like any other commodity. The Widow's Hollow conspiracy represents one of the most systematic examples of localized corruption and organized murder in post-Civil War American history. Constance Harwick's ability to corrupt entire governmental systems while eliminating threats through seemingly natural deaths demonstrates how isolation and economic desperation could enable crimes that would have been impossible in more developed regions. The case also illustrates the challenges faced by federal authorities attempting to extend law and order into regions where local officials had been compromised or eliminated. Turner's successful investigation required techniques and resources that were not available to most law enforcement agencies of the period, suggesting that similar conspiracies may have operated undetected in other isolated communities. Modern forensic analysis of the preserved evidence has confirmed many of Turner's conclusions about the methods used to commit the murders, while also revealing additional details about the sophistication of the conspiracy's planning and execution. The systematic nature of the financial records, combined with the careful coordination of official cover-ups, suggests that Constance possessed organizational skills that were far ahead of her time. The story of Widow's Hollow serves as a reminder that evil often wears the mask of respectability and operates through the corruption of institutions designed to protect society from exactly such predation. Constance's success depended not on supernatural powers or exceptional violence, but on her understanding of human weakness and her willingness to exploit the desperation created by war and economic hardship. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Constance's crimes were the product of extraordinary circumstances, or evidence of a more fundamental corruption that could emerge in any isolated community where oversight is limited and desperation is high? Could such a systematic conspiracy exist in today's world, or have modern communications and law enforcement made such crimes impossible? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about whether justice was ultimately served, or if Constance's escape represents a failure of the system she had corrupted. If you enjoyed this investigation into one of America's most carefully hidden criminal conspiracies, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the dark corners of history that powerful people hoped would remain buried. Share this video with someone who loves true crime and historical mysteries. These stories need to be told no matter how disturbing they might be.